think part of this conversation that is not really talked about nearly enough as well is just how much leverage the popular registries have over all of this stuff. Because, there's it's one thing to be, pushing malicious code somewhere via that registry, but ultimately, like, they are the ones that have the keys to whether or not that stuff is like freely available to everyone. And it's a really hard job. And when you talk about, so many packages that are, phishing related or just malware in general, like, how do you deal with typo squatting, for instance, and this kind of thing? And we have that on just a lot of volunteers are the ones making these decisions that really impact so many things. And so, I think it's a really, it's an underappreciated piece of this, that there's just a lot of real built up leverage and vulnerability in that part of the supply chain as well, which,
And I think it gets us to a point where we need to have, because we've somehow ended up, we know how we've ended up in the middle of these big international governmental policy infrastructure conversations. We need to create an environment where we start to discuss that across the board. So we have, proper international discussions that engage the open source communities with governments. So it has to be beyond a few companies talking to a government. It has to be all of us sitting at the table, understanding what's going on, and our representatives, impacting on those decisions. And we need to do something to make sure that the way that this is going to be divvied up, I don't know if that's understandable in American, but, split.
Yeah.
So the way it gets divvied up, it can't all end up going to the same projects or the same maintainers. It needs to be equitable in the way it's shared. And it's not just money. Money's important, and we need a lot of money, but we also need resources. And there's a need for that to filter through all the way to skills development and education. We need the right coding or the right practices, the right computer science being taught in high school, being taught in universities, to apprentices, so that those people with the skills are there for the future. And I like to think that what's happening is a sort of readjustment. So, when engineers started to code, you collaborated. It was mostly in universities, and it was a collective project. And then us lawyers got it wrong, and we put copyright on code, which changed everything. And if we hadn't done that, you wouldn't need, if there hadn't been regulation and laws about copyright for code, you wouldn't have needed licensing. You could just all have collaborated.
What would the alternative have been, though? Like, how
I think you would have created collective equity, and you'd have created code that was for everybody and belonged to everybody, and that might have been really nice. And that's sort of where we get to, not quite, because we have this legacy of copyright that we have to live with, and all the stuff that's happened over the last 30 or 40 years. But I like to think it's just a reset, a rebalancing. And if we think long and hard now, and we do this well, that this will be the way we go forward. But if we don't think long and hard, people are going to look at open source and they're going to think it didn't work.
Wait, I want to dig into this. This is very interesting. So, like, let's say I'm starting a completely fresh software project. I have no dependencies. I'm going to write my own operating system, my own, I'm just going to, build it from the ground up. What would that look like? Like, how would I, what would that mean?
It's impossible, right? That's so much work. How are you ever going to do?
It's not impossible. I mean, not at all. Why?
It's a lot of work. I'm sure people who, build operating systems are, okay.
It's probably a lot of work, Avi.
It's a lot of work, Avi.
Because how much are you borrowing now from other projects, even if you don't realize it, because you've looked at the code, you've said like, this is interesting.
Well, okay, I mean, just as a proof of concept, like, let's say I'm going to go build my own, I'm going to go build my own computer. I'm going to have like a very simple, 8-bit operating system, just as a proof of concept of what a non-copyright version of open source looks like, where I can still collaborate and there's no copyright. What does that mean?
You see, that can't exist, because you have this concept of public domain in the US, but we don't have it. So you can't not have copyright on code. So if you start from scratch and you say you're going to forget all the laws, and you're in, another, I don't know what the right word is, this, a nirvana for coders, where you can just use code and not worry about copyright. In that nirvana, you can start and you build everything, and everybody can just take it and use it. There's no, there's no issue. There's no fighting about it. There's no worrying about whether it's open or proprietary. There's no, can I make money out of it? They're making money out of it over there, because everybody just uses it. It belongs to all of us.
Okay, but here's a weird thing, though, because we're advocating for more government oversight and control to secure these things.
I'm not arguing for that.
Well,
I'm definitely, no, let's be clear. I'm definitely not arguing for government oversight and control. I'm arguing for governments to start to engage and to work with us to work out.
The difference?
Be really careful. There's a huge difference. So, and I've been really specific, talking to people like the Commission who were talking about this a few years ago. You should not and you must not regulate coding. So what you regulate is the use cases and how the users use it. And they were talking about, do we regulate how is certify open source coders? I mean, you can't do that. Well, to me, it's a freedom of speech, right? It's an expression, it's a language. So, absolutely not. But what you regulate is the use case, and that's already happening. So if you're in financial services, if you're in automotive, you've got regulations, and you've got liabilities. What you need to do then is to understand it. What I think governments should do is I think they should set up public-private partnerships. I think they should work with enterprise. I think they should work with engineers and all of us who form this, broad community around open source. And they should develop what I would call a steward, which would be an organization that is almost like a tide lift, that sanitizes the code that's used by the public sector, that sits between the communities, the contributors, whether they're business communities, individuals, whatever it is, that sits between them and government usage so that the public sector manages itself and does it right. And it depends on how you define an OSPO. I don't think it's really an OSPO. I think it's a hybrid between an OSPO and a foundation.
I mean, it still puts someone in charge of that kind of like oversight and government oversight. It doesn't have to be government. It's just another body that
but oversight for their usage, not oversight of open source. Open source should not be regulated. Let's be really clear on that. Software should be regulated.
I agree.
Yeah.
But
I don't want anybody listening to this to go off and think that's
they're all going to go
right.
off.
I guess it's just that I would even be maybe a little bit dubious that any government is capable of being involved with something that it doesn't regulate.
Oh no! I think that's no. So there are a lot of them are very involved with stuff that they're not regulating, and that's the problem. So they need to sort of work out a way, and they need to manage it for themselves so that the end product is well managed, and the end product being the services they deliver to us as consumers, to their citizens. But also they need to give back. It's inequitable. Right, so they need to be giving back funding, and I don't want them to go off and do that country by country, because if they do, you might disagree with me, but I think if they do, it's just going to be an absolute mess, and you need to have them integrate somehow. We almost need a UN, and I know that the UN isn't the perfect example, but we need a UN of open source. We need a way for all the governments to be looking at digitalization together. Even AI ethics has got a similar problem. You need it to work cross-border, and you don't want pockets of differentiation that, really throw everything out of kilter for everybody else. And you don't want the funding and the resources all being applied, as I've said already, in one place. You want them to be equitably distributed, and in the unsexy areas as well, right? Because they need it.
Yeah. And so, Amanda, so copyright bad is what you said. That's what I got. Like we need to abolish all copyright. And it was a mistake. It was a mistake.
I think it was, right. Personally, this is not, an Open UK opinion. I personally think it was a mistake.
Okay.
And I think it would have been so much better if they hadn't done that. And we'd created, one of the things I've talked a lot about is a digital public good. And that open source ought to be characterized not just in the commons, but as a digital public good. And that is a way of managing it. We're not going to escape the copyright. I mean, I've had this conversation for over a decade. You're not going to go and change the laws.